turn in your Bibles to Numbers. I know we've been using Nehemiah as a jumping off point, but let's go ahead to Numbers chapter 25, and we've been talking about the subject of covenants. Covenants are just an important facet of understanding the Bible and understanding our relationship to God, because the idea of covenants really carries within it the idea of relationship. And we've mentioned already before how it is amazing that God would entangle himself, connect himself, deal with human beings. Because he's God, he can do whatever he wants. He shouldn't have to make promises or make deals or contracts with folks. But this is really another way of saying, when we talk about covenants, the very nature of God's dealings with man. And I was just thinking as I was sitting here, how natural it is for us to make deals with people or make arrangements with people, even kids on the playground. Right? They're negotiating things, and they talk about how if you give me this, I'll give you this. They trade Pokemon cards, they trade candies. It's very natural, even for kids, to relate to one another by making these kinds of promises, pinky promises, and all that. It's just a natural function of human beings to want to relate to people in interconnected, interdependent ways. And so it is that God himself, he is a deal-making God, you could say. And I don't mean that as in he's offering bargains or he's a snake oil salesman or anything like that. The very word in the Old Testament that's often translated steadfast love is chesed in Hebrew. And chesed means covenant-keeping, steadfast love. It's a reference to God's commitment to his people. And it's spoken of, in a way, in terms of his desire, his willingness to make promises to us and to keep them. So when we talk about covenants, we are not just talking about arrangements. We're talking about God's very relationship to us and the promises that he makes. So we've talked about the covenant, so to speak, between God and Adam and Eve when he placed them in the garden and asked them to be his stewards. And then after they broke that, we talked about the series of consequences and judgments and promises he made to them to one day restore and redeem them. We talked about the Noahic covenant, which is a covenant God made with Noah after flooding the earth, and to never wipe out the world in that way again. And then we talked about the Mosaic covenant 2 weeks ago, and this arrangement that God had made with the people, or the Abrahamic covenant, which is an arrangement that God had made with Abraham and his descendants to make them a source of blessing for the world, that in him all the families of the world would be blessed. And we have there the very hint and promise of something like a nation, a people, a land, and from this land, this nation and people would be a blessing and a light to the whole world. And also the promise of a seed, a singular descendant of Abraham who would somehow be the linchpin for this. And that goes back even to Genesis 3, when the woman is told by God that she would have a seed that would one day redeem mankind. And then we talked about the Mosaic covenant, which was more of a conditional covenant, meaning that the Israelites had an end of their deal they needed to keep up as they became this nation God called them to be. They were to follow this list of commands. And if they did, they would be blessed. If they didn't, they'd be cursed. But even that is still kind of subset of the Abrahamic covenant, because within the Mosaic covenant was this built-in was, you are going to disobey, and when you do disobey, I'm still going to gather you up from wherever you are, and you'll still be my people, I'll still be your God, but still, don't do it. It's kind of one of those moments where God's sovereignty and human responsibility are just, right there like two train tracks next to each other. Talked last week about how the Mosaic covenant is not necessarily something we need to keep now as believers, and some of the reasons why. And today we're going to talk about the priestly covenant and the Davidic covenant, also two very important ones. The priestly covenant, or the Phinaic, named after Phineas, you may not have ever heard of. That might be something new to you, and it comes from Numbers chapter 25. So again, the importance of all this is that God is making a relationship to people and making promises to them that are eternally significant. Just for some background, Numbers comes after Exodus. Leviticus. Exodus is when the Jewish people have exited Egypt after their oppression and slavery under them for 400 years. God gives them the law and gives them the priesthood, which is what Leviticus is about. So Exodus, Leviticus. And now that they have a law and a priesthood and a system of worship and a system of their government, they have been wandering throughout the wilderness. Now, they were supposed to take a very quick trip from where they were at Sinai straight to the Promised Land. And it would not have taken very long at all. Weeks, maybe. If you're going really fast, maybe even days. But it's millions of people. But because of their disobedience and hard-heartedness, God makes them to wander for 40 years until that generation dies out. Now, along this way, they have encountered different nations. And as they get closer and closer to the Promised Land, these nations start to oppose Israel because they sort of see that they make a lot of mischief wherever they go, because it seems like some God is with them that gives them success. So they're afraid, they're worried and concerned. One of these men was the king of Moab, who is Balak, and he recognizes that the Israelites are coming through, and everywhere they go, unless you make a deal with the Israelites, you're going to get stomped on, because their God, again, seems to be winning the victory for them. So he has this brilliant idea to ask a prophet, Balaam, to pronounce a curse on Israel. If you remember the story of Balaam, this false prophet, he asks him to curse him, and Balaam's the one whose donkey starts to rebuke him and all that story, if you remember. It's not necessarily significant to this, but Balaam cannot utter a prophecy against them. He cannot do what Balak, the king of Moab, tells him to do to curse the Israelites. So Balaam says, I got a better idea anyway. All you need to do is just throw some really awesome parties with pagan women, all right? And what's going to happen is those Israelites are going to see these beautiful Moabite women, and they're going to be drawn away to them. That's all you need to do. And these women can introduce them into the Moabite gods and, really, talk them up and entice them and lure them away. That's all you need to do. Get them to commit immorality and idolatry. All you need is a party and Moabite women. And no surprise, the Israelites fall for it. They just Balaam cannot speak a prophecy against them. Anywhere they go, they have military victory, but you introduce some women to the equation and they're done for. So Moses tells the people to warn them, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. That was the Moabite god. So Moses is saying, there's some of you that are starting to go away to these women and to this wicked nation. You need to kill them because they are a danger to our nation. So one such man is Phinehas. Now read this with me in verse 6. And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. Tent of meeting is like the place where the ark dwells. It's like the tabernacle. And so this man, while they are weeping over the sin of the Israelites falling into this idolatry and immorality, an Israelite comes flaunting his Midianite, his pagan wife. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation, took a spear in his hand, and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. So Phinehas rushes at the man and the woman. They were perhaps even doing something as idolatrous and wicked as trying to, or actually fornicating there in view of the congregation. Again, a total flaunting of this, of their idolatry and immorality, and Phinehas kills them both. It is meant to be kind of a shocking scene, not because Phinehas killed them, but that this man had the audacity to do this in front of everybody and try to rub it in everybody's eye, and let alone God's eye. So here's the comment, or the reward, you could say, from the Lord. Verse 10, Yahweh said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous, and God made atonement for the people of Israel. So here you have God making a covenant with Phinehas and with his descendants after him. It's not a very well-known covenant. It certainly doesn't get as much exposure as David's covenant or Abraham's covenant, and yet it carries the same language and same perpetual or eternal promise. Like, God is telling Moses, if it wasn't for Phinehas doing this, my wrath might have consumed all of the Israelites. Now again, God's sovereign. It's not that he knew or didn't know what he was going to do, but it's anthropomorphism, if you remember that term. God is using these human terms and emotions to express his fierce wrath against sin. This was always going to happen, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, God is commending Phinehas for forestalling, and he says even like making an atonement for the people of Israel by killing the Moabite woman and this Israelite. So he is commended for his actions, he has forestalled the judgment, and he makes a covenant with him. He calls it a covenant of peace. That's just funny because this man just killed two people, but he killed them in order to make peace between God and the Israelites. Otherwise, there would have been a conflict. And you know who always wins in a fight between God and anybody else? God, every single time. So there's a peace that's made by Phinehas' actions here, and so it's a covenant of peace, or acknowledging the peace that he made, and he is said that he would have descendants who would perpetually serve God as a priest. Now this seems kind of peculiar. If you know what the New Testament says about the priesthood, we don't need a priesthood. Jesus is our great high priest. 1 Peter talks about how we are a kingdom of priests. Like each one of us has direct access to God. I talked this morning about the priest standing in the middle. Well, as a Christian, we don't need anyone to stand in the middle between us and God anymore. So it is kind of peculiar to think that this is a perpetual priesthood. Not even the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant has an expiration date on it, so to speak. As sort of it's not a perpetual covenant the way the Abrahamic covenant is, or as we'll see, the Davidic covenant that has a shelf life to it. But no, this even exceeds the Mosaic covenant. But the Mosaic covenant is what has the descriptions of what the priest should do within it. So this is like a priesthood within but outside of the Mosaic covenant through Phinehas. Well, what's going on here? Why is this important? Well, this is one of the hints that we have in understanding eschatology, or the end times. Now, this isn't the only significance, but this covenant comes up again in the book of Ezekiel. And in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 44, we're talking now about when the people are restored, the Jewish people are restored as God's people, God's people. There's a temple in which they are worshiping, and this is not referring to back in Jesus' day, and we haven't had another temple since Jesus' day. This is talking about some future time, and look what it says in Ezekiel 44:15. But the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who kept the charge of my sanctuary when the people of Israel went astray from me, talking about Numbers 25, shall come near to me to minister to me, and they shall stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord Yahweh. Ezekiel 48:11 also says, this shall be for the consecrated priests, and he's giving measurements of this temple and the territory, and he's saying there's a section of this temple or this compound that will be for the consecrated priests, the sons of Zadok, who kept my charge, who did not go astray when the people of Israel went astray, as the Levites did, Numbers 25. So in this future kingdom, in this future temple, there will be priests from the priesthood of Phinehas serving in it. Now, if you don't believe that there is a future for Israel, and if you don't believe that there is a future worship for the Jewish people at a future temple for 1,000 years, okay, not to get too much into it, but a 1,000-year kingdom of the Jewish people where there's a temple and there's worship occurring at the temple, you have a hard time understanding any of these promises. You have a hard time understanding number 25 because, well, how is this in any sense true that he had perpetual descendants that are going to serve in this context of Ezekiel 44 and 45? It's also mentioned in Jeremiah as well. It's tough if you don't believe that there's a future for Israel. So the covenant, the priestly covenant, is actually important for us understanding why we hold at our church that there's still a future for the Jewish people. It also tells us something of the nature of God's promise to us that there is a perpetual priesthoodliness that is going to happen into eternity. Well, how is that going to happen? Why would that happen? That we would need a priest eternally? Well, it's sort of an indicator or a pointer, a signpost to Jesus. Because Jesus is a priest forever, according to the book of Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4 says, "4:14, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So there is a sense in which a priesthood still exists into eternity future, and that is the priesthood of Jesus. Now, Jesus is not the line of Phinehas or Zadok or anything like that. He's not a Levite. He's from the tribe of Judah. But the idea that a perpetual priesthood will exist, it's a reminder to us of Jesus as our priest. So we believe literal future kingdom for Israel, where there'll be a future temple for 1,000 years, where Phinehas' descendants, according to this promise in Numbers 25, will serve as priests because he alone was willing to defend the honor of God's name when all the Israelites were going for Baal. Okay, so that's the priestly covenant. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't, now you know about it, but it's an important one because it's a perpetual one. Moving on then, so we have, after the people make it through the wanderings in the wilderness, they get to the promised land. God gives them victory as they conquer the different pagan nations in the promised land. That's where Joshua comes in, the book of Joshua, the book of Judges. The problem is, as we've said many times in our afternoon services, the people God put in charge of the nation, at best, they would rule it well and die. At worst, they were so often prone to sin and temptation just as anybody else was. So you have this problem of leadership. By the time you get to 1 Samuel, The people are tired of having this crisis of leadership all the time. And when they look out to Moab and all these other nations, you know what they have? Dynasties. See, the judges were appointed by God. They rose, they fell. Generation, 2 generations could go by, and then another generation would come up, and they'd lead the people and then die. But those other nations that had dynasties, they would always have a king, someone on the throne. That's what kingliness, kingship is not that they're just a leader, but the idea is that their descendants are always on the throne. So the people of Israel said, we need that. Because we totally acknowledge that whenever there's no leader here, we go sideways. So how about we have a king like all the other nations? How about we have a dynasty where the people descended from this king are expected to rule and reign, and we can hold them to that accountability? How about that, God? What's the problem? Problem is, God is their king. So they're sort of rejecting God by saying, we want a king here on earth to rule over us. And, Samuel's defending God's honor. It's almost like, God led you out of Egypt. He gave you his word. He gave you the priesthood. He gave you the sacrificial system. You don't need anything else. You shouldn't need a king. You shouldn't need a dynasty. God is your king, and he's giving you more than enough tools in order to judge and live yourselves. No, we want a king. God says, Samuel, give them a king. But first, let me give you a really terrible example of a king. So 1 Samuel, most of it is about Saul and David, but really it's about Saul. And Saul is a weak, half-hearted, inept, selfish, ultimately self-destructive king of Israel. And he is, in a way, everything wrong. He pretends to honor God, and then he quickly whips around, turns away from him. He's a coward. He is at other times he is petty. At other times he is completely blind to his own sin. At other times he is fully aware that he's a sinner. He tries to kill David over and over again, who consistently tries to humble himself and submit to Saul. He is everything wrong. It does almost everything wrong a king or a leader or a president or prime minister could do. He does almost everything wrong. So you got a negative example, and then you get the positive example. In contrast, David, who humbles himself, who honors the Lord, who hardly takes a step without saying, Lord, do you want me to do this? He's exact opposite of Saul. He's not necessarily the biggest or tallest, but he has all the strength in the world when he submits himself to the Lord. Military victories, wisdom, people follow him, natural leader. 2 Samuel, after Saul dies, David is finally made the first true king of Israel. And this is what happens in 2 Samuel 7. The same night, the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, the prophet. Go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh, would you build me a house to dwell in? Meaning David wanted to build a temple for God rather than just this tent that they kept putting the ark in. I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So it's like David was like, man, I have a nice house, but God's rolling around in this tent. That's not right. And God is saying, do you think you are the one that needs to do me favors? I'm God. I chose to roll around and dwell in this tent. I could have easily told the judges, build me a house. I didn't because I'm God. I do what I want. I'm the one that does stuff for you. You're not the one who does stuff for me, right? Now, we do things in the name of Lord to defend him. But when you're talking about like doing favors for God or something, which is sort of what David sounded like he was saying, no. I'm the covenant-making God. I'm the one who can do great things for you. So, verse 8. Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you went, and I've cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will make you a house. So David's saying, I'll make you a house. No, I'm God. I'm the one who makes houses. I'll make you a house. And he doesn't mean a physical house, but a dynasty, a legacy. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love, chesed, will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. Now, here in 2 Samuel 7, the word covenant is not used, actually. But it's clear that Yahweh is establishing a promise to David in a covenantal sense, in the sense of making a promise, a deal with David. Now, there are two kinds of promises that are being knit together here, woven together. One would find fulfillment in David's lifetime, and then there are some that would be fulfilled after his death. Now, for those ones that are fulfilled after his death, some are going to be fulfilled very quickly after his death. Some of them a few years later, some of them a few generations later, some of them 1,000 years later. Some of them, even now, wait to be fulfilled. Notice some of these promises that were realized in his lifetime: a great name, a place for the people, and rest. When you read through the rest of 2 Samuel, you'll find that he was able to conquer the enemies. The people flourished and had safety and peace and security and rest, and David's name was made great. In other words, his deeds and his exploits, everyone acknowledged and recognized them. I also think it's interesting that when he tells David, I will make your name great, one of the most popular names in the world for like 3,000 years, David. I mean, you look at I've met people who are from China and other places, and they go for the name David, and they think it's very American, but what is it? It's actually from, really, in a way, they're demonstrating by their name choice the truth of 2 Samuel 7. So whenever I meet someone named David, I think about that. It's a promise, Davidic covenant promise, whenever you meet someone named David. So these are some things that had a temporary initial fulfillment, but they are foreshadowing a future permanent fulfillment, because this promise does not last very long, where the kingdom is split and then there's a lot of division and fighting and civil war. Now, some of the promises that were realized after his death were the fact this house would be built, right? He says, your son shall build a house and I will establish his throne forever. So God is kind of saying, yeah, someone is going to build me a temple. Your son, Solomon, is going to build me the temple, the first temple. But I will do something greater. That's a temporary structure. I'm going to establish his throne and your throne forever. You can't compare that deal, right? Like, God is giving the greater thing here to a person. He's giving someone an eternal promise of an eternal kingdom. He also promises a seed. And again, this is a line of thought that is coming all the way back to Genesis 3, that there is a person. Now, seed can mean, in the Old Testament, like all of your descendants. But there has been a way that it's been used with Abraham and here with David and in Genesis 3 with Eve, where we're not talking about many people, but one. And we know who that's referring to, that ultimately we're talking about Jesus. But you see a little bit of a hint of these things with Solomon. You might say, well, wait a second. It seems like this is talking about Jesus, talking about Solomon, is talking about some future descendant of David. Yes, all of the above. You just have a foreshadowing of it with Solomon. Now, this type of covenant, the giver of it, in this case God, has an obligation, a duty to protect and do these things for the recipient. You could say that the Davidic covenant is unilateral. Does David have to do anything to earn this? Or Solomon? Or any of his descendants? No, it's just kind of a bare promise that God is going to do this because he wants to, because he's chosen to. It's unilateral, unconditional. He even says that when some of these descendants, they sin, I'm going to discipline them and I'm going to set them straight. So there's always going to be this promise of God of the Davidic kings. This is sort of framed in terms of an adoption as well, that sometimes kings would use this kind of covenant, or sometimes it's like a grant, to allow faithful servants to receive sonship and receive the blessing and privileges of a son, like the inheritance and land and a dynasty. And those were also typically unilateral, unconditional. So this follows even the model of certain covenants that people would make at that time, kings and powerful people. David and his sons then would be viewed as Yahweh's sons. And while sometimes their disloyalty, going against God, might have some consequences. Sometimes these bad kings would lead, the Israelites astray and so on. But God is saying that that is not forever going to be the condition. And this is important because some of the last kings of Judah. So remember in 586 BC, the Babylonians, they come in, they destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple. You know what else they destroyed? The kingship, the dynasty. So since about 586 BC, there's not been a true Davidic king, nor has there been a Davidic king who sat over a nation of Israel to this day. So 2,500 years, there's been no nation of Israel that has had a Davidic king sitting on a throne over it. So that also was lost and broken. But the unconditional nature of this promise from God to David is that that is not going to be a forever condition or status. That there is going to be one day God bringing about a national Israel, all these promises being true, and a seed, a descendant of David, sitting on a throne, ruling over an eternal kingdom, not just a temporary kingdom. So, what's interesting, the next significant event in David's life after this, you have military conquest in chapter 8, you have David being very kind to one of the children of Saul, or a relative. More victories in chapter 10. What's chapter 11? David and Bathsheba. He commits adultery. And what this tells us is, what should be the consequence of adultery? It should be death. Why is David not killed? The only reason, I think, is because of this covenant. David was in violation of the covenant, but the commitment of God to be faithful to his promises allowed for a substitutionary atonement. Who died? Who did die? Two people died, actually. Uriah died, right? But that was part of the sin. But who's the other person that died? David's son. Right? David had a son with Bathsheba, and that son died. And it's kind of God's way of saying, you are threatening the covenant I made with you by sinning in this way. But I'm showing you I am going to keep my promise But there's going to be discipline and there's going to be consequence. Your child with Bathsheba is going to die. And that is going to remind you, you are supposed to have a descendant that sits on this throne. How dare you commit this act of evil and defiance against me? Let me remind you what you've done. Let me remind you who's in charge. Let me remind you of the covenant. You should be the one dying, but I'll take your son. And of course, there's a little bit of foreshadowing in all of that, to the sacrifice of Jesus. There are what are called the Davidic Psalms, and Psalm 72. You don't have to turn there, but Psalm 72 is essentially a psalm looking forward to the day when a Davidic king will rule over the whole earth. Solomon is writing this, and he knows the Davidic covenant because he's the recipient of it, and he essentially is looking ahead to a day when a Davidic king will rule over the entire earth. Has there ever been a day in Israel or the earth's history where a Davidic king ruled on his throne over the whole earth? Is Solomon a liar? In Psalm 72. Is God a liar? 2 Samuel 7. So when's it going to happen? If it hasn't happened already, when does it need to happen? Future, right? Future. Psalm 89, psalmist in Psalm 89 is frustrated that so many of the kings of David, and as you read 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, these guys, most of them are knuckleheads. Most of them are not very faithful men, unfortunately. Many of the kings that came from David's line were disloyal to the Lord. But does that threaten God's promise? Oh, they're too screwed up. I take this back. I said all that stuff to David, but no. Can't do it now. They're too messed up. I realize I made a mistake. No. Psalm 89 has the hope. It looks forward to the time when a perfect Davidic king will come and perfectly fulfill all the expectations of the Davidic promise, and he will rule perfectly over the world. So you have this idea even throughout the Old Testament, after the death of David, after the kings have risen and fallen, this king has not come yet. So there was expectancy. At the time of Jesus, there was expectancy still. The king must come. The king must come. All those promises to David, they have not come to pass. Maybe Jesus is that king. Now they suspected that he must first come, or they suspected that the king would come and do what? Oh, you're under Roman Empire? Oh, the Jewish people have no homeland, independent. Well, what's the king going to do? Like at the time of David, what did David do? Went around and he was, whooping the Ammonites and the Moabites and all these Philistines. He's going to do that. He's going to come and he's going to conquer those Romans. And they're going to get their independence and the kingdom will come. That was their expectation of the king, of the Davidic king. But what do we know? First, Jesus had to come not as the conquering king, but as the sacrificial lamb. Why? Why did he have to come first as the lamb, not as the lion? We'll get to that next time when we talk about the new covenant, which is the last covenant, so to speak, that we'll discuss. So, the Davidic king is going to end up being kind of like the key to the Abrahamic covenant and the Noahic covenant, all these covenants. David ends up being sort of this Davidic covenant person ends up being this key to unlocking all of these promises of God. So they're all pointing towards something, and the new covenant will hopefully answer some of these questions and will overlap with the Davidic king as we get to Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So next time, let me pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you that you deal with us, with sinners. And while we should be bargaining, let's say, from the position of weakness, and you positioning yourself as the one with the stronger leverage and the stronger hand, and yet here you are with David and with others in these covenants being so kind and gracious to give, to adopt, to lavish blessing, to say you will be the one to work for us. It's an incredible thought that this is how the God of the universe chooses to relate to humanity and in the redemption. And yet, Lord, we know it's not separate from you and your glory and power. It's just that you choose to show your glory and power by using us, by reckoning with us sinners who don't deserve it. So we thank you, Lord. This is grace. This is chesed. This is just a loving God committing himself to loving us to the end, to the uttermost, into eternity. And we are recipients of that. We are blessed by that. So, Lord, thank you. Thank you that you are God, that you have all the prerogative to make these deals, so to speak, and you made them all in our favor. So may that change us. May that encourage us. May that give us hope for tomorrow. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you all, and I pray you have a blessed week this week. Yes, Holly. A covenant and a blessing? No, I mean, I think a blessing is something that has no strings attached or no obligations or duties. It's not a contract. So these are like contracts. They are a contract to bless, though. Like my promise and my contract, God saying my contract is to bless.
God issues blessings and curses.
Yes.
Is the blessing different than the covenant? Like, is there?
No, so for example, in the Mosaic covenant, you had blessings and cursings that were both built into the covenant. Yeah.
Blessings like the subcategory.
Yes, yeah. So it'd be covenant, and then here's the consequences for disobeying the covenant, and here's the consequences for keeping it. So.
When David is cursed, and God says, I'm going to take your son's life, not yours.
Yes.
And there's a specific curse that goes along with that. That's part of the covenant.
So I would say it's implied 2 Samuel 7 when it says, when he commits iniquity, I'll discipline him. That. So it should be, if you commit an iniquity like adultery, you should be killed. But instead it's like, when you commit iniquity, I will discipline. So the discipline was his son dying. And I think you can also make a pretty easy connection, like, you should have died, but instead God is going to cause you the suffering of your son dying. Now he's going to have many more descendants, so like in that sense the Davidic covenant is not threatened because there's many more children. In fact, Solomon will be the child of Bathsheba and David too, and he will be the covenant keeper. So if there's any part of it that's kind of not interesting, but has some element of who does this apply to, or a question mark is, well, the kingship was going to go through a certain line, so to speak, and not like every descendant of David was necessarily eligible, right? So you have Absalom, who kills all his brothers and then tries to kill David in order to take the kingship towards the end of 2 Samuel. So that is sort of because David was being passive. David sinned, and he in his older age he just got very lackadaisical in his relationship to the Lord, and that resulted in a lot of stuff happening real bad with his sons. So yeah, Absalom killing a bunch of his brothers, Absalom ultimately being put to death, and Solomon being the child. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that happens in the Old Testament where you have these fight over who's going to, that's human history, like fights over the kingship. And so God is sovereignly working who that will be, who the kingly line will be. So when you read a genealogy of Jesus through both Mary and Joseph, there's a Davidic line that's tracked and followed. So there's probably a story there.
The judgment does
Right. Yeah. No, that is sort of intriguing. Like, why not? Yeah. So if you look at it, like, you thought David was really close to Abigail, for example, but that's not the line that he has. And he had many wives, incidentally, but not Abigail, which was one of his first. And you thought, oh, like he really loved her. No. You might think Michal, who was technically his first wife. This is Saul's daughter that Saul gave to David as like a reward for all the, Goliath slaying and Philistine stomping he was doing. Here, I'm Michal, my first wife. She had poor Michal, because when Saul starts to persecute David, David leaves, Michal stays behind. Saul gives Michal to some other guy to be her husband. But then when Saul dies and David comes back, he's like, go get Michal. And then she's the one that resented David worshiping when the ark was coming in, and he's worshiping, and apparently clothes are falling off of him, and she's like, oh, look how noble our king is, and making a fool of himself almost. And then it's like, so God made her childless. And like, for one husband, back, forth, insults the king, and then childless. So, like, why is it Bathsheba? There's probably something to study in that. I didn't necessarily look into it, but the child that came from the adulterous relationship where she was effectively, stolen and then a man murdered. Like, why her? And maybe, again, like God chooses a lot of people, you're like, why did you pick that one? Because that doesn't seem very good. So I don't know, maybe that's part of it, is just to show I can use this line, even though it's the one that's the most tainted. Maybe. I look into that. So, does that answer that question? Okay, sort of. No, that's okay. It's okay. Okay, you're welcome. All right, thank you all.